Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson and Robert Schut, and I believe we are on seminar episode 3 of Soren Kierkegaard's Training in Christianity. Do I have that correct, Bob?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. And if you are watching this on YouTube and you say, Luke doesn't look like he is broadcasting from the same location, nor does that even look like Luke. He's got a mustache. Let me assure you, I have not been replaced by a clone. I know there's a lot of anxiety about clones out there right now, but I am Luke Johnson. So, Bob,
yes,
now that I've allayed everybody's fears that I'm not a clone, why don't you introduce today's topic?
Okay, today we continue in Training in Christianity, and we're going to talk about the inviter. I'm going to finish section 2 today, but it starts out with the inviter, and if we just kind of become familiar with it, the invitation is an invitation given to all those who are heavy laden with burdens. Come to me and I'll give you rest, is something that Jesus said. And that's how he opens up the section. Section 2 opens up with, he makes it very clear that he's speaking about Jesus Christ here. And then he lays down a foundation of premises. But it is not, Kierkegaard says, it's not in his glory, but it's in his humiliation that we're going to discuss here today. And that's going to be explained a little later on as we go through this. We have to begin here with a knowledge of Christ as a humble servant, not as the God of glory, but we have to understand Christ here as a humble, simple servant, as a human being. Understanding the things that Christ said fully, we have to understand them from the point of view from which he said them. So that here the context is extremely important. It's very difficult to create the true Christ from an abstraction, from just pulling out different pieces of what Jesus said and then reassembling the way we want to reassemble them. And that's kind of one of the guilty things that religion has done with the Lord. But when we understand that it was from a humble point of view that he comes, it also prevents us from raising ourselves to too high of a level. And by that, he's talking about the idea that if we understand that our Lord and our Savior was a very simple, lowly man, then by what rights do we have to think of ourselves any higher than that? And it's good to kind of have that reminder, that kind of take a check on the water level to see where we are in the tide. And he says that we can't really walk as a contemporary of Christ if Jesus was in his glory, because we couldn't relate to Jesus if he was some kind of a superhuman being.
Right. I mean, all you have to think about is the episodes of the prophets encountering God in the Old Testament, right?
Right.
Like if individuals were able to perceive God back then, ultimately they were only to be able to see like his backside, or were blinded, or suffered some sort of sensory problems as a result of trying to behold God in his full glory. Right.
But here we have an opportunity. The only way that we can really, in a sense, walk with Jesus is if we walk with him in humiliation. This is where we have that common ground with him. Kierkegaard feels that history has tried to alter Christ and who he was. And interestingly, that history continues today. So it's not just history in the past, it's kind of history in the present. People still do this today. There's manipulation of who Christ was.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah.
Did you by chance see this article that's going around some of the science journals about what Christ really looked like? It's been going around. I won't name the journals' names because, well, heck, I might be working with them one day and might want to kiss up to them. But they were sort of pushing this stouter, more muscular,
shorter.
Dark, short, right? Have you seen this image of Christ that's being pushed in scientific circles at the moment?
I haven't actually seen an visual image created, but I did read an article on what they considered that he would look like as a Jew of that time, being about 5'5", darker skinned, black hair, certainly not blue eyes, blonde hair, and that.
It just makes me also very suspicious about why that's coming out in science journals right now.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't look too far beyond it. I just kind of thought it was interesting. Just kind of taking it in my stride.
Makes me feel weird. Proceed.
Now, care must be taken with history. My own experience is that we really have to be careful what historians say, just as much as we are theologians and philosophers. I don't think historians are really that far away from philosophers. From what I hear from some historians, they are just as liable to twist the artifacts and the evidence to make it say something different than what it actually is. So
as a philosopher who's reading a lot of history right now, I'll tell you this: both of them tell really cool stories.
Okay, really, huh? Yeah.
Great, cool story, bros. But I mean, Kierkegaard says this, right? We've looked at this in the philosophical fragments and elsewhere, where you have to kind of create this sort of idealized narrative, right? If you're going to comprehend the objective, right? So whatever is presented to us as history is ultimately going to be decided on by the subjective consciousness of a handful of individuals, right? And they're going to create a total narrative that they're going to try to make cohesive and ignore anything that might be anomalous, right? So we're not getting the full picture. And that's sort of what happens with philosophy too, right? Philosophy is always going to be in favor of coming up with a universal system. And if there isn't something that doesn't quite fit into it, like, I don't know, Jesus Christ, right? Like that's a problem for Hegel, right? Because like Hegel doesn't like to have a paradox like Christ.
Yeah, so some of the problem with historians and even philosophers and that is that they've already come to a conclusion, and now they're going to show how history proves their conclusion. Sometimes you have to leave a little bit more of an open space there between your conclusion and the evidence. So sometimes we need to follow the evidence, and sometimes it will come up to our conclusion, and then that's the way it's supposed to work. But if we're so dead set on making things come to a conclusion and then making the evidence fit that, that's how come we have so many innocent people in prison right now. That DNA is finding out they weren't guilty after all. So sometimes it's good to leave that channel a little bit more open. And one of the things that this is something when we look into the church today, because remember, we have to always bring back to the church, not so much because of me and my attitude, but because that's what Kierkegaard is really writing about. What happens is if the church makes Jesus unreachable because he was so high, so holy, that the problem is it makes us feel like we are just helpless victims of sin and we can't ever rise above that. And that becomes our excuse for who we are. And it turns our faith into ideology.
Yeah, I can see. Have you seen Godfather 3?
I don't think I have. No.
That's the one with so Al Pacino, he tries to get out of the mob.
Yeah.
But he even confesses his sins, like all the people that he murdered as the Godfather, but he won't have the conversion to authentic faith because he doesn't feel like he's deserving of atonement.
Are you talking about in a religious sense atonement or just a psychological sense of atonement?
There is this I think you're talking about this chasm between like himself and Jesus Christ, and because he perceives such a distance, he is content to burn in hell for all the things that he's done.
Okay. Yeah.
Like that's his mentality as the result of that gulf between him and God.
Yeah, and that's a good way to express it, exactly what we're saying. It's a good kind of story. So when it comes to history, we have to be very careful that we don't allow the historical reality to alter our religious reality, and vice versa. We have to be careful about how we take history. Make sure that we don't try to alter history to make it fit our conclusions. And that's difficult. I don't know if anybody can completely do that, but we have to be careful. We just have to be aware, I guess is what I'm saying, aware that that's a possibility. And this reminded me, I've done a lot of research into his heresies and the early church, and it reminds me of all the conflicts that the church had when they were trying to define and explain how Jesus was God. Some people made him too divine, and others made him too human. They had groups called the Monarchians, Sabellians, Adoptionists, and Modalists, just to mention a few. And it's very interesting if you ever wanted to study it. But it's extremely confusing because there's so much overlap between these groups. But it's really worth it because you can see these heresies, actually, the heretical thinking alive today. And people have no clue that they're following actual heresy rather than straight standard Christianity. So,
do you think those individuals that were leading those, who were, I don't want to say inventing those heresies back then, do you think they had an agenda, or do you think this was just people innocently trying to intellectually conceptualize what had just happened in human history with the intrusion of the God-man?
There was probably a little bit of that, but it may have been more seeking for fame, seeking for the answer. You know, this has got to be the answer. Also, in some cases, the individual who started it got lost, and the people carried that idea much beyond the one who initiated the idea.
You could write books. You could write books about each one of those movements.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And they are fascinating. How they some of them were just forced to deny what they were teaching because it was so hard, so much against what the church wanted it to be, and that even went back and forth. So who depended upon who was leading the church at the time. So it's nice to become aware of all that stuff, but
I think it's essential to become aware of that. And to be honest, I want a lot more of my scholastic pursuits to go in that direction because there's nothing new under the sun, right? It's that these same heresies keep broaching the surface into our modern day context. We may just be giving them different names.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
So the technocratic singularity may have something in common with one of these old heresies that you referenced that I don't know anything about, or some movement within the ecumenical church.
Well, sometimes between you and me and the millions of people that are watching, sometimes I found out it's hundreds of millions. I just got notice from YouTube. Okay, well now I feel a little more conspicuous, Luke. But what's kind of the way it affected me is I wish sometimes I could just go back to when I was much younger and I was naive and just believed everybody, you know, and it was so much easier in that way. Now, when I listen to people, I'm really listening to them, and I'm not only saying, "What are you saying?" but where might you be going with this idea? You know, I see them in a whole different context, and there's that aura of kind of, I don't want to say suspicion. It's not quite suspicion, but it approaches suspicion. You know, and it is difficult, more difficult now for me than it was when I was more just easily believed, easily swayed by people, you know, impressed by the authorities, so to speak.
Yeah. What are the mantras from 1984? Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
Or ignorant. What was it? War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength.
Yeah, they all sound pretty pretty 80-ish. But yeah, so now I'm in a whole different world right now in my own thinking. And I hear things that other people don't hear. I hear the same words, but I know where the words are leading, and other people don't necessarily see it that way. And that makes it difficult sometimes.
That's why we're friends. We both hear things, Bob.
Yeah, we do. But this kind of stuff that we're talking about here allows us to, when we take such a distorted view and have a conclusion that we want, it makes us turn Jesus into whatever we want him to be. And that's usually what makes us feel comfortable. So we join groups that preach a Jesus that makes us feel comfortable. And that flies right in the face of what Kierkegaard says, is that Jesus is an offensive person and we must be offended by what he's saying. But people run away from that. And that's exactly what he's talking about here.
Right. Yes, I wonder what the word is. It's not anthropomorphizing God, right? It's to take God and even mold him into smaller subsets of humanity. So if you want Jesus to be an ascended mystical master, right? There's that brand out there, right? If you want a black Jesus, right? There's a black Jesus movement. If you want the Da Vinci Code Jesus, right? The one that had a child and did all, right? There are all these different types of Jesuses out there.
Yeah, and just pick the one you like the most, right? That's and he makes a comment that the words mean different things depending upon who says them. And I remember somebody had said that, so I looked up into my philosophy books, and it was Michael Foucault who kind of had that same idea. Maybe he picked it up from Kierkegaard. He's the one who said that if you're in a courtroom and you have the judge and you have the accused, if the accused looks at the judge and says to the judge, "I sentence you to life imprisonment," it's a joke. Nothing happens. But if the judge looks at the accused and says, "I sentence you to life imprisonment," it has an effect. And so this is what Foucault was saying, is that it depends on who's saying it and the context of it's being said, not on the words. And I thought that's an interesting way to see it.
Is it what Michel Foucault book was this?
Oh, this is just a book on Foucault. It wasn't his books. It was just
he's got a book. He's got a book called something with punishment in the title. I'll look it up.
Oh, okay. So and now Kierkegaard is going to relate this to the phrase "come hither to me," or "come to me, all you who are heavy burdened and laden, and I will give you rest." He said who says that really matters, and the context in which he says it makes a difference. So now he kind of takes the opposite side of this argument about Jesus, and he's giving us a more worldly view, a critical view of Jesus. He says, was Jesus really, when he said that, was he able to help others, even though he couldn't help himself come down from the cross? Jesus said he had nowhere to lay his head. So how is he able to say, "Come hither, and I'm going to help you"? Was he really in a position to make those words effective?
Not in this. Not in this world. In the next.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting question, right? Because are we? I think so that we don't fall into the same error and trap that we're claiming that others do. Are we molding Jesus into something that he is not? I mean, can he give those that are in this realm rest and alleviation, not just a sin atonement through an act of faith, right? Because I mean, obviously there are temporal benefits. There are temporal and eternal benefits. So I guess the error that I'm committing is I'm overemphasizing the eternality aspect of Jesus Christ.
Well, eternity means past, present, and future in a sense. So if you say eternity, think about it in the times of you are in eternity now. You've got one foot in eternity and the other foot in the present. So you're walking towards eternity. So what you're saying is true. You just need to kind of redefine eternity a little bit.
Well, what would you say? I mean, what would you say about the rest that Jesus Christ can give us in this purely temporal realm, if we're not thinking with eternal categories?
I think it gives us a whole new context of reality. And so we see what we have and what we don't have in the context of what it means to have and not have. You know, whereas if we live in a world of prosperity, and if that's what's preached is prosperity, and we don't have prosperity, well, then we think we're missing out on something.
Right.
But if Jesus is saying, no, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who are persecuted, blessed are those who suffer, then we see our situation differently. And this is a warning that just kind of my own self have become recently aware of. This is really the danger of the preaching of the gospel of prosperity. Yeah, many people are going to see wealth, and maybe they'll become wealthy too, and they'll be successful people. But the problem is they're paying a big price because they're not getting the real gospel. They're not seeing their lives in the real context of, like you said, of the true eternity. And the true gospel is being lost because it's slowly being, I don't want to say deceived, but distorted. And people are not going to know what it means to have nothing. And they're going to think, I'm suffering, God hates me, this is the end of my life, I must have sinned, I must have done something wrong. When this is what Jesus says, if you want to be a Christian, this is what you have to expect. But today, we expect to become wealthy if we're a Christian, and that's just a deception.
You know, what's interesting is that I'm currently preparing this other seminar with Dr. Jonathan Cook. We're going to be talking about Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I'm about third of the way through the book. Have you read Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Maybe a long, long time ago. I'm not sure I read the whole thing. I think in school we covered it a little bit.
Yeah, I've never read it in its entirety. I mean, I think I was taught as part of a history unit or something like that.
Yeah,
it was never a required reading. But what's very interesting is the intense spirituality of the Negro slaves in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And they're constantly asking this question about, you know, how they have such faith and have such a sorry lot, you know, not having any political, financial, even sort of personal freedom, you know, literally being bound and sold at markets and things like that. And so this prosperity gospel would have been totally nonsense, right? The slaves are like, what are you talking about? I'm not prospering around here.
To the slaves, but not to the slave owners.
Right, not to the slave owners. Slave owners would have. I'm sure, I actually think some form of the prosperity gospel was used to justify the institution of slavery back then. I don't doubt it at all. So, but what's interesting is I've been thinking about it as I've been reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, and how, you know, how everything works towards God's final ends. I wonder, in a weird way, I wonder if the Negro population that had to endure slavery actually preserved the authentic and true religious spirit of America in the midst of its growing industrialism, and in a way was able to preserve Christianity by taking sort of the 40,000-foot view of it. And then I think about it in other ways where there are other Christian groups that are persecuted in the world right now, what they are doing for the larger body of Christ. For instance, how, you know, even though these individuals are half a world away, and I'm not trying to sort of to justify anything that's done to people, but I wonder if, like, you know, all the Christians that are being beheaded in Syria, or the church that's persecuted in China, if in some way, whenever that happens, that sort of infuses the proper the proper and true spirit of Christianity into the larger body of Christ as some sort of reminder there, so that when you do sort of punish and persecute some aspect of it, it has this rejuvenating effect on the whole.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever thought about that? Does that make any sense? Do you know what I'm talking about here?
Yeah, because see, God's method of operation has always been to preserve a remnant, and in trials and tribulations, that's when the remnant really shows itself.
Yeah.
And on those people, the harder they squeeze, the more juice you get out of them. The more spiritual they become, because I mean, there's a certain element of desperation. I realize that in the psychological area, some may be doing that, but that doesn't necessarily negate it. There's nothing, there's nothing wrong with that. And so, trials and tribulations is something that we are forgetting about in this country. And maybe that's why this prosperity idea is so strong here, because people are not really suffering as much, or they want more prosperity. It's just, I don't know.
They know they're involved in less than virtuous activities, and they want some sort of legitimation for it.
Yeah, and actually in Scripture, in the Gospel, you don't measure yourself by your money. You don't measure yourself by your wealth, your faith. You don't measure how much God loves you by that. And you don't measure your love for God by those things. What you measure it with is your holiness. That's what you measure it with. But who wants to measure their faith with holiness today? Let's measure it with something else that I can go out and earn and make and do. My pride. Let's measure it with my pride. Prideful things. But that's not how the Scriptures or Jesus taught us to measure our faith.
No. Well, I think the idea that I was trying to get across here is that this remnant, wherever it is actually the thing that's driving, is the proper develop. If we can't talk about the body of Christ, is the proper engine of the development of that body. I don't know, just something that occurred to me.
No, that's good.
I mean, think about how that institution of slavery produced Martin Luther King, right?
Yeah.
And then how that became such a powerful moral and religious teacher, and in part sort of inspired revival in his own way. So,
no, that's good. I'm glad you brought that up. Now, Kierkegaard goes into something here that I probably need to explain a little bit. He goes into about the statement that Jesus is God. Jesus says he's God. And I have to be careful, because Jesus really never says, I am God. Okay. He implies it in certain ways. Usually they are ways that are subtle and ambiguous. And Jesus was a master at ambiguity. But he uses certain terms that would make the Jew of his days ears stand up and say, wait a second, are you claiming to be Yahweh? So he never directly says that, at least during his earthly life. But the information is there. And if you listen carefully, you can hear who Jesus is actually claiming to be. Okay, so I had to kind of make that a little bit clear. It actually needs a whole other podcast of itself.
Yeah, I was going to go into it, because I'm like, I was going to be like, I might need you to elaborate on that, because I seem to I bet I could find a few verses where it seems to me that he does claim to be the Son of God, like I and the Father are one.
Oh, yeah, Son of God. Yeah. He shows himself to be. He usually uses the term Son of Man, which was a very loaded term to begin with, and a very ambiguous one. But he never actually literally stands there before the Pharisees and says, I am God. Okay, so I just want to make that clear.
Right. There is a difference. Yeah, there is a difference between saying I am God and I am the Son of God.
Right. Okay. So
the difference between saying the Father and I are one and like I am the Father.
Right.
There's a difference.
So for those theologians out there, we've kind of covered that and made that clear. Now, Kierkegaard says that many men might say that they're God. When Jesus said it, many thought that he was committing blasphemy. That's one of the reasons they wanted to get him crucified.
Right, right.
And so he asks the question here. He says, well, then, was it human punishment of God? Was it God using humanity to punish Jesus by having him crucified because he said he was divine? So that's a question that one might answer. Can we accept the invitation now, but without accepting the inviter? So can we separate the teachings of Jesus without believing anything ontological about the teacher, that he had any particular divine character or was any particular authority? Can we just say, yeah, Jesus said a whole bunch of nice things, let's just believe in those things?
I guess you could. I mean, it seems kind of pointless.
Well, do you think
I guess what I guess what I'm trying to say here is that you can, but I mean, right? Like, what's most important, and Kierkegaard harps on this throughout his authorship, is that the teacher is more important than the teachings when it comes to Jesus Christ. But when we're talking about a different type of teacher like Socrates, the teachings are more important than the teacher. Socrates is just a vessel for the teachings. Jesus's teachings are secondary to his being.
Yeah.
And what his being can confer in regards to sin atonement.
Well, there's
I guess what I'm saying is, like, if you're gonna, I guess I'd be like, if you're gonna deny Christ being the Son of God and hold on to his teachings, like, why even bother? Why not just like, you've already got Socrates? Like, why latch on to Jesus?
Well, that's just the whole. Now, Kierkegaard talks about this historical thing, but today we have that movement called the historical Jesus. That's the whole point of the historical Jesus movement, is to remove the deity and remove the authority of Jesus and just accept some of his teachings.
Some of his teachings.
Some of his teachings.
And that's the key thing, because all of the totality of his teachings involve him saying I and the Father are one. Right. And so so that's a part of his teachings, and therefore would imply the ontological reality of the intrusion. But also he has many other teachings that would be offensive, right? Like Jesus talks about hell a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't he mention hell a lot?
Absolutely.
And he talks about, and I imagine that someone who's going to be latching onto the teachings of Jesus Christ is going to be conveniently forget any ones that are connected to the idea of hell as well.
Well, again, that comes to the idea of bringing Jesus into your comfort zone. But this way you can take Jesus's teachings and mix them up a little bit with Lao Tzu, mix them up with Aristotle and Socrates, and come up with your own Jesus.
And Nostradamus, don't forget Nostradamus.
And Nostradamus, throw a few people in there, and you've got your own Jesus. So that's kind of what's going on today in certain areas. We have to be careful of that. So now we go on to section A, on page 35 in my book anyway. Section A, the first period of his life, it's called. And he says, let's start by speaking about an average person who is our contemporary. Many give Jesus a sense of reverence when speaking about him, as though he was some kind of a great person. But this reverence that they give him can be a false reference and almost a mocking reference if you don't do what he says to do. So you can take Jesus and hold him up and speak highly of him and say how wonderful he was, and say how much you kind of believe him. But if you don't follow him, it's almost like mockery of Jesus. So if he was so great, and if his teachings are so wonderful, and you say you believe them, and you say you're a Christian, then do them, And if you don't want to do them, then say, I'm not a Christian. I believe with another group here. I'm changing the name and becoming another group. That Jesus is only one of the elements of our faith. But if you're going to claim to be a Christian, then you ought to follow what Jesus teaches. I mean, that's all. That's not too much to ask, right?
Well, I claim to be a Christian, and I find it hard to follow everything that Jesus taught.
But you try to follow. Right?
I try. Yeah, I definitely try.
Yeah.
I definitely fail.
Yeah, but you keep getting up and walking, dusting your clothes up and walking, and I can tell you, don't ever stop. You have to keep doing it, because eventually God gives you the strength. He gives you more faith than you could ever believe. But sometimes you have to go to the dark places first, Luke.
Yeah. Oh, yep, yep.
No, so now let's flip the coin over. Can we believe in Jesus' stature without believing in his teachings? So at first we said, can we believe in his teachings without believing he's the Son of God? But now, can we believe he's the Son of God without believing in his teachings?
I think the only way you could do that is if you would claim that his teachings have been corrupted by the scribes that wrote them down. Because if you don't believe in his teachings, then I think you're going to be calling him a liar. If you're going to call him a liar about his teachings, then why would you trust that he is who he says he is ontologically or existentially?
Yeah.
So so the only way I could see, I mean, I've thought about it for 2 nanoseconds, but the only way I could see squaring the circle on that one would be is if somehow you say that all the teachings that are attributed to Jesus are not properly attributed, that some of them are frauds.
Well, do you think today that in some church groups that they place Jesus high up as Son of God, as divine and all that, yet they go off and live on their own and still continue to live the way that they do, thinking that this God is going to forgive everything that they do?
Oh yeah. I mean, I constantly have to check whether or not I'm doing that.
Yeah, we all do. But there's a check that we have to make. So, but that would be an example where you make Jesus to this all-forgiving being who does not hold us to any kind of a test, because if he did, we'd all fail. That's kind of an idea. And so therefore, we can believe in him without really worrying about being humble and worrying about suffering and worrying about our own holiness. That's for the monks and the priests and whatever group belongs in the organization, but not for us regular guys, right?
Yeah, professional holy people.
Professional holy people. That's right.
Because they've never become corrupt or done anything morally reprehensible.
Right. So we've even got the problem there with the higher ups. But so he says that Jesus in his humiliation is a lonely man, or was a lonely man. And the form that he appeared in, that of a human, was not what people expected him to be. They didn't expect the Messiah to show up as Jesus, not the way he was. And when he performed signs and wonders, people got the idea he was some kind of a hero. Okay, the heroic Jesus, at least for a period of time. And multitudes were carried away with him with hope that he would become the king of Israel, save them from the Romans, okay, and do all this. And then Kierkegaard says, was this madness that he tried to make himself into God? And I couldn't help but to think of Kim Jong-un, because he is the God in Northern Korea. And that's exactly what he's trying to do, is make himself God. And when he does it, we say he's mad, right?
Yeah. Don't believe everything you see on the TV, Bob.
Okay. Well, if we just presume that,
North Korea might not be what you think it is.
Okay.
But I get your point.
Okay. Now he says, Kierkegaard goes on, he says, sometimes someone can pull it off, this idea of I am divine. But how can Jesus pull it off? These people can pull it off if they're young enough. But he says that Jesus is already 30 years of age. How can he pull this off? And by backing down, well, he was about to be put to death here. Shouldn't he have backed down from this and said, "No, guys, I'm only kidding. I'm just here for the glory. Don't put me to death. Let's not take it this serious." But he didn't. He allowed them to crucify him without denying him being the Son of God. And Kierkegaard puts it this way. I kind of know it's kind of almost sacrilegious what he says here. He says Jesus really didn't have much of a future when you look at it from a human point of view. Let's face it, he didn't even have any job prospects. Okay, what was he going to do? Go off and hire himself off as the Son of God, as some religious teacher or something? That's about the best he could do, right? Well, he was a carpenter, though.
Yeah, there's big money in that. There's big money in that. There are a lot of people who have made money off of that.
Yeah, true. And he did have his carpentry business to fall back on. So I guess Kierkegaard forgot about that.
Well, it reminds me of a quote that Pope Francis got in trouble for saying pretty recently. He said, humanly speaking, Jesus's life ended in a failure. And a lot of people were like, that's black. A lot of people in the evangelical communities were like, that's blasphemous.
No.
But it seems to pair well with the quote that you just got from Kierkegaard. I want to ask you something real quick. I meant to ask you this earlier. You were mentioning about these permutations and these idealizations of Jesus or whatever. I've never seen these Mel Gibson the Passion movie of the Christ or whatever. I think he's making a sequel or whatever. How does that fit into this conversation? Do you think he's presenting a distorted image of Christ, or do you think that he is telling the Gospels in the way that they ought to be told? I haven't seen it. It seems pretty brutal. But I think that's the whole point, is so that you can understand the suffering that Jesus went through.
Yeah, that part. The rest of it is, every once in a while there's something questionable. It's not a total distortion of it. The best way to present the gospel is reading scripture. And I think anything Hollywood does is going to tend to distort. Okay. Yeah. Do you know how much the Gospels wrote about the crucifixion?
I would imagine from a percentage-wise standpoint, not very much. I imagine something like less than 10%.
Oh, much less than 10%. I don't have a percentage, but they gave very little short things about, Jesus was crucified, and that's it. They didn't go into the blood and the guts and all this to draw up your sympathy and pity for Jesus.
Do you think there's something problematic about what Gibson's doing by overemphasizing the crucifixion?
Yes, I do.
Can you articulate more clearly what that problem is? I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just super curious.
No, I think it creates more pity for Jesus, and he didn't want pity. Remember, he told them, "Don't pity me, pity yourselves," during the crucifixion. But pity makes people feel good. It makes people feel faithful and holy. But that's a confusing thing. That's not it. If you really feel that way about Jesus's crucifixion, then live the life he wanted you to live. That's, like I said, that it's not how much pity you have for the crucified Jesus. It's how much love you have for the resurrected Jesus. Right. So we can't emphasize the crucified Jesus, or else we're missing the whole point of the crucifixion, and that was the resurrection.
This is very interesting. I like talking about this idea of taking fragments of the gospel and over exaggerating them. I have a friend who mentioned in one of his YouTube videos about how there's like kind of a mini Beowulf story within the gospels, specifically when after Jesus dies and goes into Hades and frees all the Old Testament saints, right? And like there's a whole epic that occurs right there that there's like a whole superhero movie right there that I don't know if has ever been blown out and exploded like it ought to be. But I understand what you're trying to say here. The danger.
Yeah. The phrase I think comes from First or Second Peter, and it's only like a little bit of a phrase, and people take that and distort it and create a whole thing out of that, and it again, it's exaggerating one little piece, and it throws the whole context of everything off. And you can't do that. You got to take it as one little piece, and it doesn't really say he freed the Old Testament. It just talks about him descending into Hades,
right,
where he preached unto those people. It doesn't say any more than that. And people take that and exaggerate it, and before you know it, like I say, you have a full movie, cinematic production based upon 2 sentences.
I know, but it would be kind of cool. I know, I understand the dangers, but I'd still my imagination is desirous of seeing that movie.
Yeah,
but
well,
I understand the theological dangers. I understand.
Well, you know what? I think this is a quotation. This may not even be a quotation from Albert Einstein or not. But do you know the most powerful nation in the world, according to Albert Einstein?
The imagination.
Yes, the imagination.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to have a very powerful imagination to believe it, to believe the things that Albert Einstein said.
Well, anyway, I think that's a good
thing. He wasn't lying to you about the amount of imagination you would need to believe in the theory of relativity. He was truthful about that.
Okay. Point taken, Luke. Another podcast. So Kierkegaard says, well, why would I really follow such a person who claims to be God? And he says, no, thank you. So, but he's speaking from a point of view, and we'll see that right at the end of this. He's speaking from the worldly point of view, we should say. But he says, nevertheless, he says, there's something extraordinary about this man and who he was. One might want to follow his philosophy, but certainly not his theology. In other words, it's nice to say, love your neighbor as yourself. Who doesn't want to follow that? That's so easy, right? So people have that. You notice that if you go into some friends' houses, Christian friends, they have love your neighbor as yourself embroidered on a nice little frame and so forth. But do they also have the one that says, if your right hand offends you, cut it off and throw it away? Do you ever see that embroidered on somebody's wall? Jesus said both of these things in the same context. But you see what I mean? So we want to believe in his philosophy, but not his theology. And that comes under the what would I say? The category of DIY Christianity, do-it-yourself Christianity. Just create your own version of it. So Kierkegaard goes on. He says, do I really want to join this man as his disciple? And he says, no, because it would make me look foolish. If I follow somebody who claims to be divine, it's going to make me look foolish. Now, I myself, Luke, personally, have seen this in the church. I have seen people who think they're intelligent, who go to church and become even president of the council at churches. They become fully involved in churches. And they don't want to believe that Jesus was divine because they're afraid it's going to hurt their reputation as being an intellectual. And man, this was a wide awakening for me to see how this idea, this postmodern idea, has permeated into the church. How even leaders in the church don't want to accept what actually makes Christianity Christianity. They're followers of Bart Ehrman and Borg, and they read those works more than they do Scripture. So anyway, that's kind of where that comes from.
Yeah, I want to add something. since we're talking so much about imagination and pride and pretending and things like that.
Yeah.
Just to scripturally to insert something here, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5 from the KJV, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just like to include that as we meditate about the power of imagination.
Yes, it's serious business too. Yes, it could lead us into all sorts of distortion. And it's not one of the things that I was just kind of looking into today. Deception is not total lie. Deception is based on enough truth to make it believable. That's why it's so hard and so easy to be deceived, because there's just enough truth to make it look believable.
Right.
And so we have to be very cautious as serpents, as Jesus said. So anyway, back to Kierkegaard.
And one more, if I can, Romans 1:21, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened.
Yes, very good. Yeah. Thank you for reading that one. Then their mind.
Einstein was very right about that power of imagination.
Yes, very good. And you heard it here. So now Kierkegaard makes us understand that even if we accept the sayings of Jesus, or at least many of them, we can't accept who he claimed to be. That's what this is what he's kind of building this premise here. In other words, we don't have to accept who he claimed to be. And look at it from a worldly point of view. Did Jesus inherit anything? Did he make any money off his books? Did he become a millionaire? Did he live in a mansion? No. And he says if he had money, he probably would have just given it away to the poor.
Well, if you ask Nietzsche, he attained some sort of Ubermensch immortality, right? Maybe we're talking about him 2,000 years later.
Yes, he did.
I believe Nietzsche said there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross.
And I think that's a good saying, really, if we look beyond it. But I think he's got some truth to that. I think we should all think about that. Nietzsche said a few things that really should make the Christian think, and I think that's one of them, that we should think about that. So did Jesus live to become prosperous? Was his goal to become a prosperous or a great man, a man of reputation, a man of honor, a man of prestige? Is that what Jesus lived for? And we know from scripture that he had abhorred such things as that. He didn't want that kind of a lifestyle. And just consider, you remember the temptation in the wilderness, right, Luke? And what did the devil tempt him with? He tempted him with power, with wealth, and with health. Does that sound like a particular type of gospel to you? Power, health, and wealth?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And who is preaching this gospel in that day to Jesus?
I'm sorry, you cut up there for a second.
Who is the one, in a sense, preaching, tempting Jesus in that day?
Well, in that particular scenario, I mean, the devil was the one.
All right, that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm looking for. So.
The answer was so obvious it made me doubt myself. I just wanted to add here. I believe the quote that the quote from Nietzsche is from the Antichrist. In truth, there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross. So if you want to go find that, it's in his book, The Antichrist. Ironically enough.
Yeah. Well, okay. So he said a few things, but not too many that were worth preserving.
I think Nietzsche still has a role. I like it would have been really amazing if Nietzsche and Kierkegaard would have known one another, because
Yeah.
they were so, they have writing styles that are very similar. And Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are like gateway drugs for people who get into studying philosophy. And
Yeah.
depending
Yeah.
on which one you find ultimately determines kind of where you shake out on these questions. What's very interesting to me is I found Nietzsche first. If I had never discovered Nietzsche, I never would have studied philosophy.
Oh.
So
Well, I like the name of his.
So I will say that whether or not, I'll say, just to prove that God can use all things for his aims,
Yeah.
Nietzsche seduced me into philosophy, but then I studied so much philosophy that I learned how to slip into,
Yeah.
I became a holy roller, I guess. So
Yeah. No, and each one of us, comes to Jesus in different ways, and not necessarily that we should suggest everybody goes through our path, because my path was certainly not something that I would recommend to somebody either. But I thought it was interesting how Nietzsche, one of Nietzsche's book, Beyond Reason, right?
Beyond Good and Evil.
I'm sorry, Beyond Good and Evil. Yeah, Beyond Good and Evil is actually, you could take that theme and write a wonderful Christian book based upon that theme, Beyond Good and Evil. So at least he was able to come up with some good titles for books. I kind of like that title.
And I also think it's very important to test your Christian beliefs. And Nietzsche will challenge you in such a way that if you come back to your Christianity, you chose it and you weren't indoctrinated with it.
Good point. Excellent point. Thank you. So why did Jesus make this claim about being the Son of God or being God? He could understand why a man would push forward in a crowd or in a line if somebody at the front of the line was giving away money. He says, but why would he do this? Why would he push forward only to be flogged and crucified? It reminded me of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. Jesus knew at this time that he was going to be crucified. He was going to be killed, murdered. Yet the way it portrays him marching into Jerusalem, knowing full well what was going to happen. And that's kind of an amazing thing. And a lot of times people don't make that connection. He knew what he was getting into when he marched into Jerusalem.
Well, you could say, is there a time that Jesus didn't know that was going to happen? I mean, this goes back to the whole question about when did Jesus' divinity actually manifest itself? Like, did he know this as a child when he was arguing with the priests in the synagogue?
I would say he had an inclination of it. I'm not sure how clear he knew it was going to happen, when it was going to happen. Well, even when it was going to happen, he knew he had to fulfill a certain destiny before it was ready to be done.
That's a massive theological conversation.
Yeah, it was probably a developing vision that he had of himself. So I think we can take it that way, but I don't know. It
raises an interesting question about whether or not Jesus has total foreknowledge, right? And then if that foreknowledge can ever be nascent and flourish at some point. And and we get back to the earlier point of the conversation about how so many heresies occurred when they're trying to get the doctrine of Christianity together, right?
Yeah. And it's actually good if you're a student and you want to read Jesus' divinity, read all the heresies, because it'll help you understand what's wrong.
Right.
And then you can, because you may be holding on to some sort of heretical understanding of Jesus and God, and you might not know it unless you read about it. So I would recommend it for the serious student. Like you're saying, reading Nietzsche can help you with more clarity understand your faith. It's the same thing. You read about the heresies, and it can help you clarify what you really do believe about Jesus.
Do you have a good book recommendation on the heresies?
Yeah, actually, there's two of them. Let me say something so that the camera goes on you, and I'll disappear and reappear.
Okay, no pressure there whatsoever. So, in order to kill some dead air, I'll just check in with you guys and say, I really appreciate you guys going on this journey with us and leaving your comments and downloading the Noetic app. All right.
Okay, I'm back, and I never left. Okay. Yeah, I have this one by A History of Heresy by David Christie Murray. That looks like this. I can't see my picture here, but maybe you get the book. This is small. This is a good version, very compact, and I believe he was a Quaker, educated at the universities of London and Oxford and Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, and yeah, he was a Quaker, member of the Friends. And then this is one for a little bit more serious by called Heresies by Harold Brown. This one here, which is another good, a little on the thick side, but I would recommend go with the thinner one first. That's what I usually do. I have to admit it. Size matters when it comes to books.
Well, yeah. You got to prioritize, and you got to see if you want to go deeper into the subject. So I understand.
Okay. So what Kierkegaard says is, I can make no judgment about Jesus, especially when he says he's God. Because if this is true, he's applying a standard that's far too high for us. And why is that? I asking the question, why? Why is it too high for us? Oh, well, because such things are illogical. And this gets into the meat of Kierkegaard. Because the idea that Jesus is the Son of God is completely illogical. And if you're trying to come up with a logical definition or a logical understanding, it's a hopeless endeavor, according to Kierkegaard and me. I mean, I don't think there is a logical way to explain it, nor should, because that's not how we're supposed to understand it. So, it's like God puts this block there for a reason. He doesn't want us to become theologians and philosophers. He wants us to become his children and meek and to become are you still there, Luke?
You back, buddy?
Yeah. Yeah. It looks like I lost you for a second there.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I don't know how much you missed, but I was just saying that the idea of Jesus being the Son of God is very illogical, and is supposed to be illogical. And Kierkegaard understood this, because it's not that we're supposed to pursue God through logic, philosophy, and theology, but rather pursue him through humility and becoming children of God. And that's how we really understand his idea of who Jesus was. And he continues, we cannot allow him to be God, because that would give what he says authority. Right? That would mean, as you said before, that would mean that heaven exists, hell exists, evil exists, righteousness exists, and most of all, there is such a thing as absolute truth. We can't have those things, Luke.
Oh, we'd have to, because if we had those things, we might have to change the way that we were living.
Yes. And that's exactly why people will not accept Jesus as having that kind of authority.
It really gets in the way of your own personal agenda.
Kind of does, doesn't it? Yeah. That God should come as a human being is beyond the expectation of any reasonable man. Why would God come from a nice comfy throne, a nice comfy place in heaven, come down here and save mankind? And this is actually what restrains many Muslims from believing in Christ, is because they cannot conceive of Allah coming down and saving mankind. He's not that kind of a God that would do such a thing. But the Christian God is. And anyone who would claim that God would do this would be a blasphemer, which is pretty much what Christians are considered in Islam when they say such a thing. The philosopher, he tells us, would say that this was dreadful, that one would even want to be God. So I have a quotation on page 44 here to read. Let's see here, 44. Okay, I have to switch into my reading glasses now. It says, He has no doctrine, no system, no fundamental knowledge. It's merely by by detached aphoristic utterances, some bits of sententious wisdom, constantly repeated with variations, that he succeeds in dazzling the masses, for whom also he performs signs and wonders, so that they, instead of learning something and receiving instruction, come to believe in him, who continues in the most odious manner possible to force his subjectivity upon people. There is absolutely nothing objective or positive in him or in what he says. So here's Kierkegaard talking about Jesus here, as though the world would see him and be critical of him. So,
well, what do you make of that? Do you think that's actually the case, that Jesus had no doctrine?
in the sense of doctrine, in the formal sense, sort of, yes. Teaching, which is really what doctrine is supposed to be, no. He did have teaching, definitely had teaching. Sermon on the Mount is one. So if we just take that alone, that's not doctrine in the classical sense that we talk about it. It's not something you just put in a frame, like I was saying. That's kind of like the way I see doctrine. It's something that we just believe in, but we don't actually have to do it. We just have to believe in it. It becomes more ideology. So that's how I would differentiate doctrine from teaching. Teaching is something we hear and we do, and doctrine is something we hear and we ideologize it, or what's the right word?
We turn into an ideology, but I'm sure that's a word. Ideologize it. But you know what? Like, one of the teachings of Jesus that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because Billy Graham just passed, right?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of different opinions on Billy Graham. I'm not sure if you're aware of them, but not everybody loved Billy Graham. And one of the reasons why not everybody loved Billy Graham was because they thought that he was playing fast and loose with some of the proclamations that Jesus said, specifically the idea that the gate is narrow, or the path is only for a select few, and it's only through him, right? And there are moments in Billy Graham's mission work, or whatever you want to say, his ministry, where he talked about there being a certain sort of Christ consciousness that even non-Christians can sort of tap into and be saved by. And so there's a lot of people thought that Billy Graham, through his ministry, was ultimately preaching some sort of new age distortion of the gospel. I guess what I'd ask you is this idea that only through Jesus Christ, only through himself, could anyone have access to the Father.
Right.
If Jesus meant for there to be some wiggle room with that, or for that to be one of those hard and fast doctrines.
If Jesus meant it that way? Absolutely. He meant it that way. He's the one who said there's no other way,
right,
except by me. I'm the shepherd, and that's the only way to enter into the flock.
So I'm wondering if that's the case, right? If this is sort of a hard and fast teaching, if we might start to put that into the doctrinal camp.
Yes. It can vary. Anything that Jesus said can easily be put into doctrine and framed, and then it loses all its authority and its power. Anything like that. So we have to be careful not to do that.
It's an interesting thing, because we're getting into a very meta conversation about what's a teaching, what's doctrine that's crafted by theologians, and then what's doctrine that's communicated by Jesus Christ, right?
Yeah.
Because there are certain teachings that Jesus that were obviously allegorical, right? And that Jesus was using in order to communicate a broader idea. And then there are other teachings of Jesus Christ that are non-negotiable, that then enter into the doctrine of theologians. But then there are doctrine of theologians that Jesus didn't really spend a lot of time talking about. Like, Jesus didn't really get, like, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, Jesus didn't give some treatise on the nature of the Trinity.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. He did not. And Yeah, we could probably spend a lot of time on that.
Yeah, we could. Sorry. Keep going.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Yes, I think we should spend more time on other things than on trying to understand the Trinity. I think that's a distraction, and Kierkegaard thought that too.
You did.
Yeah, he thought that too. So I mean, I'm along with Kierkegaard. Oh, a second, I've got 3 quotes to read here in a row here because they're absolutely so important here. And then he says, but even if one would overlook the madness revealed in the fact that he thinks himself to be God, it is an incomprehensible mistake disclosing surely a lack of philosophic culture to suppose that God could anyhow reveal himself in the form of a single individual. Okay, quote number 2. And quote number 3, if this insane thing were possible, that an individual was God, then logically one must worship this individual. A greater philosophical bestiality cannot be conceived. Okay, so my analysis of those 3. Okay, let's see, let me get to it. Kierkegaard is saying in the first one that Jesus' sayings and claims are subjective and that there's nothing objective in his sayings that can be proven. Okay, so this is his challenge that he's throwing out here. As again, he's kind of wearing the mask of a critic right now. The second quotation is a little bit more on as philosophical criticism, and the third quote is a much harsher criticism of Jesus. So I read these 3 quotes because it kind of shows an escalation of his criticism that a philosopher would make, or that some kind of a worldly individual would make, a non-Christian. So I thought I'd read those 3 and see what you thought of that. Any questions or comments on those?
I'm good for right now.
Okay. So who knows if Jesus performed miracles? Who knows if Jesus gave his power to his disciples? Doesn't every parent fear somebody coming along from a cult and taking your child away to the desert or something and worshiping some Stonehenge type of image? I mean, don't people worry about that? And if the criteria of being God is to look like the rest of us, meaning being a human, then all of us can claim to be God, or at least gods. So how do we disprove that someone is not God? So if I say to you, Luke, I found some plates in my backyard, and it says that I am going to become a demigod, and I am going to start a whole new religion of Christianity, and it's going to be better than all the other versions of it, and I am going to be a prophet and a leader. How could you disprove that?
A prophet or a god? Because they might be 2 different methods to disprove your claim.
I would say, okay, let me go. A god, small g.
Well, I think about this a lot, and I don't know if I have a good answer on it that will be satisfactory to everybody. But yeah, I mean, if there's anything that you're doing that is contradictory to the scriptures, that would be sort of enough for me to be like, no, you're not a god. I think the reason why I think about this is if understand that I'm saying if we are accelerating through some sort of biblical eschaton, and the man of perdition, the man of sin, is to come onto the scene, the Antichrist, and there is going to be the second coming of Jesus Christ, how we don't get fooled into falling for the wrong one, right? Because presumably that's part of the prophecy.
Yeah.
And the only way that I've been able to sort of satisfy my own troubled mind on these particular matters, that if such an individual were to present themselves, right? Because presumably the Antichrist will present themselves with lying signs and wonders and all this great stuff, is if anything is done that's in contradiction to the scriptures.
Well, you know how they get out of that one is this individual has the power to correct the scriptures that have been, what's the right word? That need to be corrected, that have somehow mistakes have come in and they need to correct it. But even better than that, Luke, I get to write another book that's even better than the Bible.
No, Jesus said in the book of Revelation, it's done. No more. Right? He said you can't add to it. You know, what's interesting is I read the subsection of Tolstoy's, it was from the Brothers Karamazov. I'll have to look it up, but I read the chapter called The Grand Inquisitor. Have you read that?
I've heard of it, but didn't read it.
And Jesus is actually put on trial in that story, but because of the promise made in the book of Revelation, he can't say anything. He can't say anything further in his defense because he said everything that needed to be said. It's all contained within the Bible already. It's really amazing. Everybody should read it.
Oh, sounds good. Sounds good. Well, so some of the things I kind of made a little list here. I'll skip over some of them, but some of the things that I think that we should use as a litmus test of such an individual is that if they're that good, then they should be living the life of Jesus themselves.
Correction.
Yes.
Dostoevsky's the Grand Inquisitor from the Brothers Karamazov.
I read Crime and Punishment, but I didn't read that one there. Sounds good. This individual has to give up everything for the righteousness of God, empty themselves of all ego. They would. This is a real critical one right here. They would rather give to the poor than take from the poor. His message would have to be free to all people. He would abstain from any worldly vices or pleasures. And he must not conflict with Jesus in his theology or his teaching. So those are kind of more physical characteristics I would use as an initial criteria.
He will not be in the secret chambers. Right?
Right. That's right. He will not be out in the desert claiming I am Jesus.
Right.
So what did Jesus mean when he said that his time has not yet come and that there would be signs and wonders, he asks. Do these signs and wonders produce repentance? Well, during Jesus's time, they did not really create a whole lot of repentance. Some, he's saying that they did not create a lot. They produced hatred and despising of him. So when Jesus went out and he performed miracles, not only did they ask for more miracles, but some of these miracles they used against him when he went on trial. And his followers, just think, his followers are the lowest class of people. They're lepers, sick people, mentally ill. Even some were fishermen who yesterday caught herring, and today they're apostles. Why would you follow what's wrong with you, Luke? Why would you follow such a man like that? He says the poet couldn't even invent such a person who would declare himself as such a God.
Well, I'll just say this, knowing what I know now, and this all goes back to the vain imaginations and the power of imagination that we were talking about earlier. The most intellectual amongst us can very easily be blinded with pride. And so I'm very tempted now that when someone very intelligent says, don't look at that thing and don't pay attention to that thing, to look at that thing. And what's very interesting that I'm noticing is I'm seeing this story repeat itself. Yeah. I'm seeing this story repeat itself with what's going on in our world right now. And I'm seeing, I don't know where we are in the timeline, but I totally see how the meek are going to inherit the earth again.
Yeah.
Because the meek don't know what they're not supposed to investigate. The meek don't know what ideas they're not supposed to entertain. The meek have not the meek have not been sort of pridefully indoctrinated with vain imagination. They don't know. They don't know. And the freedom of not knowing that you're not supposed to ask certain questions or entertain certain ideas allows them to increase in knowledge in a way that those who are prideful and they're going to overtake the prideful. And I'm seeing it happen already. That never made sense to me as a child about how are the meek going to inherit the earth? The smart people and the strong people and the powerful people, the meek people stand no chance. Well, if the strong and powerful people are blinded to the truth, well, then they have an Achilles heel, and they don't even know it. And they don't even know they have an Achilles heel.
That's great insight. That's really good insight, Luke. Good. He says, Kierkegaard says that the mighty feared him, and his death was the only thing that appeased them. The only thing that they could do, the leaders, would be to get rid of him. That was the only way that they could eliminate the competition, so to speak. And that's what they did, thinking it would eliminate it. So now we'll go one more quote, top of page 52. For let them say what they will and condemn him as severely as they will, I can't help pitying him. I'm not hard-hearted enough for that. And I can't help showing my compassion. So that's kind of what Kierkegaard says about it is, yes, the best we could do is pity him. But remember, he's coming from a worldly point of view, which kind of plays right into what we were saying about the Mel Gibson thing. Very interesting. He says that we have arrived now at the last paragraph of what he calls profane history, which is an interesting term he uses. And this is kind of a worldly or a historical way of seeing Jesus. Many today begin with the premise that man cannot be God. And then they prove it based upon the evidence that he is not God. In other words, it's a form of circular reasoning. If you begin with the idea that no way can Jesus be God, then whatever you read is going to be interpreted based upon that premise in order to prove that premise. And so it's a circular reasoning. That's why you can't. That's why Kierkegaard tells us it's illogical, because if you start out with a certain premise, you're going to come back to that premise. And being divine does not fit into. You can't come up with a premise to defend it. So it's something that is illogical. Therefore, you can't put it into a premise. I think we talked about that last week. So if you feel the need to be helped by such a one as Jesus, you'll be drawn even into a deeper misery. And so that's where he leaves us off at the end of profane history. And profane, he doesn't mean like profanity. He means common, or, kind of like, what else would you call it? Common history, right? Or
vulgar.
Vulgar history, yeah. Right. What the man in the street believes, so to speak, right?
Yeah, but the people that are coming up with profane history are the ones who have the vain imagination and aren't in the street; they're in the ivory tower. Okay. So I wouldn't want to insult the man in the street by saying that his history is profane. That would be an insult that I would lob at those perched in the ivory tower.
Okay, I gotcha. All right, so that's it. That's the end of today's lesson.
All right, nice job. All right, buddy. I finally got my power back.
Oh, you did?
So which means I gotta race home and edit this all up for us, so everybody can enjoy it on my YouTube channel right now. But I'll have it on the Noetic app and everything else very shortly.
Great. Okay. Great working with you again, my friend.
All right. I'll talk to you soon, buddy.
Bye-bye.